Who was here this morning, or actually in the other room, on the Breaking AI session that I did with Simon Maple? You will see some overlap. But bear with me, we have a lot more problems that we're solving than just the few that we showed over there. But you will see some overlap. Anyway, I want to start with how do we develop software? Well, I made some drawings about that. First, you create a nice little MVP, or proof of concept, or however you might call it. It's perfect, it's exactly what we needed to do, it goes into production, it does everything that we do. And as you know, an MVP is never just an MVP. It stays in production because it works, right? And why not build on top of that? Because then your product manager comes up to you and says like, hey Brian, it's great, but can we add this tiny little feature to it? And you're like, sure, why not? You pay the bills. So fine, it works. It's not actually in scope, but it works. It's fine. Okay, it's in production. We are there half a year or even less, and then that top-level manager comes up to you and says like, you know what? From a business perspective, it makes a lot of sense to add this to your program. And you're like, what? That actually we need to rebuild the whole thing. No. We need this by next week. And you're like, sure, no worries. We can do that. Anyway, it goes on and on and on, because if one product manager comes like that, like, yeah, it makes sense to this, and we make like that app that rules the world, right? And you build something, you break it off, you build something extra, and it's actually not fit for purpose anymore, but hey, we already had that, so why should we rebuild it? And in the end, we end up with an application that flies to the moon, talks to aliens, and does something with helicopters. If you do this in a structural building, everybody would say this is nuts. But this is, in many companies, how we build software. And then we are actually worried, like, is this safe, you think? No. But we think we're safe with our software. And that's how bugs appear, and security issues. And that's what we're going to talk about today. My name is Brian, work for Sneak, live in the Netherlands. That's why my accent is not that great. Not important. Oh, staff developer advocate. I have no clue what that means. Ask 10 developer advocates what developer advocacy is, you will get 20 answers. I used to code a lot, now I email. That's more or less my description on it. Okay, who works with databases? Okay, you know what SQL is, right? True, fine. Okay, so I have an application, and this application, I have it in IntelliJ, and I have my plugin. It is a tools in action, though, so I'm allowed to share tools. And I have an onboard tooling that scans my code. And one of the problems that I have is that it says I have a SQL injection problem. Well, we probably know what SQL injection is, but first, spin up this thing. Now let's see if it actually runs, because something demo gods. Well, it starts up. Looks fine. So let's go to localhost. And what one of the problems that we have here is a SQL injection, or we try to search on products and description for this. Well, one thing that we can do, if you look at the actual code, and we do that in a second. Where is it? I think it is my order repository, search repository, I don't know. Just see what it comes up with. Cross-site scripting problems. SQL injection, there we have it. Great. It says it starts here at line 31, goes all the way from my controller to my repository. And yes, well, if we look at this one, you will see that it goes into my here. And let's make this a little bit bigger. Obviously, what I do here, I have an input string. And without doing any form of sanitization or validation, I put this as part of the query. And we should all know that this is not the case. But we are great developers. How about that junior that just comes from uni or from college that comes into your app team? You're like, yeah, sure, you can work this out. Anyway, the problem is what we can do here. If I'm going back to my application, I can say like, okay, let's go into this lower input and do something like, okay, switch this off. Well, I know that. So I could do something like here. With this, I cut the query, end of query, even if it's mid-level. With this part, I'm making sure that the rest is considered comments. And in the meantime, I'm just updating another query and set every price to 0, because I live in the Netherlands and I'm a freeloader. So if I do this, oh, that's wrong. Again, I know what it's wrong. Let me do this. I think this one. Thank you. Same problem as I had this morning. I have dyslexia. I'm sorry. It's product. Yeah, percentage is actually not the problem. The percentage sign can be done, but you can also have one percentage sign if you do SQL. So I did it now without it, and just look at it. And if I go to the new coffee shop, you see that all prices are 0. Thing is, who does code reviews? Sure. Who does the code reviews? Is that the new junior in your team? You say like, I built this feature for 3 weeks and now you have 20 minutes to do it because we need to go to production. Does that junior knows what this is? Probably not. Maybe it does, depends on where you go to school. When I went to uni, I didn't know crap about security. I just learned how to build, not how to break. So this was like, I know SQL, and it needs to do things, right? So I just concatenate the first one or the other one, and seems decent. However, the better way of doing it is using parameterized queries, like I would do here. So if I just switch this one out to this one, it's always hard in presenter mode to do this. And I would do something like this. And this is just one way of doing it. You will see that, I missed the lower input. Thank you, Brian. So let's remove this and do it like here. And now Copilot starts to make problems with me. I now have a SQL string over here, and I just put a wildcard here. And then I fit the wildcard with the lower input, and I do it twice. You can do it all at the same time. You can use the name parameter, whatever. The thing is, there's a difference between doing this and escaping. If I ask people a lot in the trainings that I do, what should you do against things like SQL injection, they say, well, parameterized queries. Yes, but it's parameterized queries and prepared statements, and there is a slight difference to it. If you look at a parameterized query, basically what we do is we just create a query with wildcards, then we send it over to the database, and the database already starts to create the execution path. Because the parameters are sent in a second go, the execution path is already created by the database. You fit in the parameters, and you cannot break out of the execution path. So SQL injection is not possible anymore, at least not the SQL injection that I just did, because I tried to stop the query and executed another query. Depending on the language and the framework, you're either doing one or the other. Sometimes it's just escaping on the client side, and that's in a lot of JavaScript frameworks, and then you escape it with some slashes and whatever, and you send it as one thing over to the database, or you do a prepared statement. The prepared statement way is a better way, but I'm using Spring Boot here. It depends on whatever is your JPA implementation. I'm using a JPA native query in this case. Switching over here. And does anybody know what the default JPA implementation of Spring Boot is? Exactly nobody. Who uses Spring Boot? Almost everybody. By default, we're using Hibernate. Luckily, Hibernate uses prepared statements. But you don't know if you do this and you put it in an application server or on somebody else's server, or you just run the bare bone thing. So knowing what actually is under the hood is something we need to know. If it just works on my machine and it looks great, it might be safe, but we might also be able to break out of these things. Just be aware of what you use and how the mechanics under it is. So far for SQL injection. That was easy, right? We could have spotted this if we did code reviews, and everybody does, or does pair programming. We just agreed on that. Next one. Let's go to file uploads. And I did that this morning. I let Copilot create something for me, but I just want to show you something. So say I'm uploading a file, and I'm uploading a file over here. And let's not use my normal one. Let's use Burp Suite. Burp Suite is a proxy tool that hackers use to do capture the flag things. And we basically are going to hack myself again. Let's go to the code and actually see what's going on. So if I'm going here, and it says to me already right away in front of my face somewhere that I have a path traversal problem in my upload controller. So before I actually put this into my main branch or somewhere in production, it is already in my face. What does it say? If we can read, you can all read this, right? Cool. Upload image. Multipod file comes in because it's a form that I use to in Spring Boot to say update. I'm using a time leave application, and it comes in. Multipart file is basically a POJO representation of the post request that comes into that application. Fine. Then what we do is we take the original file name and we replace spaces by underscores, and then we say, okay, what is the upload folder? Concatenate the original name because we want to preserve that for whatever reason, and then we write. But what if this name of my thing or of my file is something like dot dot slash dot dot slash dot dot slash dot dot slash, let's say slash bash wd or something like that? Because multipart file is nothing more than a POJO representation of the post request. And let me show you that it's quite easy to mimic this. If I'm going to open a browser that is connected to the proxy that I'm now loading, and I'm going to localhost 8082, I can log in, obviously user, because I work for a security company and it's a perfectly valid password. So I can go to my profile, I can upload a file, choose it. This one is great. So, file is uploaded. It's part of my profile. Cool. But let's take a look at what we actually did. Let's go into the HTTP history. And we now see that over here, I have the post request. Let's ask for that one. Post request is here, and this is the response. I'm going to put this to my repeater. And my repeater says, okay, this is your post request. The red part is actually the picture, nothing special. The thing is that this post request has metadata. And one of the things in the metadata is here, file name is Brian 500. But if I do, I don't know, and I send this, I will have a HTTP 200 response, and I now broke out of my upload folder, and this picture that I just created is probably now in the root of my project. Here. So that means I can easily break out of the folder, and depending on what kind of user my application runs on, I can go into the operating system. I might be able to overwrite things in a container that I'm running, or some parts of the operating system, and even use this request, if I know, to put other binary data in, and maybe overwrite some of the system files. Nice. And that is because I didn't sanitize or look at what the input file was. What I should do is look at the file name and say like, hey, if I normalize that, and if it starts with my upload folder, then it's okay. If not, throw an exception. But think about it, you need to sanitize or at least validate the input of whatever comes in. And even though it's a multipart file, hey, I just copied this thing from a tutorial, literally. We need to know what's coming in, we need to validate that. All right, let's go on because I only have 30 minutes. And so check where it reverses to and go on. XML parsing. Who uses still XML? You see, a lot, and I do too. In some cases, I need to connect with some of the systems with, for instance, government agencies or something like that, and a lot of that is old-fashioned XML that needs to be parsed. Well, I'm parsing XML here to import stuff. I can if I'm logging in here again as my user, I can no, it's a great password. No. In my orders, I see I can export to XML and I can export to YAML. Not sure why we should do that, but I can export and import XML. Well, I already prepared an XML file, and if we look at normal XML in a good way, it would look something like this. Right? My XML file, my orders, IDs, order lines, nothing special. However, I'm just using a Java library to do XML parsing. And the problem is that it already says here you've got XML external entity injection problems. What is that? Well, take a look. The thing is, I am using a parser here, and let's go to that parser. This is the XML order parser. Cool. I'm using the SAX parser, which is just standard Java. And I made a very naive implementation how to do that. It works. I can show you, but I don't have a lot of time. The thing, however, is that as part of XML and as part of the XML standard, you can introduce doc types and you can introduce external entities. DTDs or doc type definitions are there to connect and to see if an XML file is in a certain format and is actually valid. Sounds reasonable. However, what I can do, because this is a feature, I can make an XML file like this, which looks almost good. However, did you see this? I am creating a doc type. I define a doc type, and that doc type is not to a doc type definition file, but it's just somewhere on my file system, /etc/passwd. I bind this to a variable called xxe, and instead of the product name, I now output this. So if I do this, if I try to import this, choose file, let me see where this is. In the examples, xxe.example. You will now see that part of that I have the passwd output, which is system output, in my thing over here. Think about it. If you're using XML to connect from business to business server, you don't know what's coming in. This by default is standard on. That means by default this is available to you. Which shouldn't be, because it's actually an insecure default. But all of the Java parsers don't set that default because it's in the specs and it's a feature. So what should we do is actually enable features, which sounds weird, but that is exactly what we need to be doing. If I'm going to my parser, and I put it here under in comments, what I can do as part of my SAX parser, I say, I'm sorry for the code formatting. Here, set feature, disallow doc types to true. I need to explicitly set that. I need to explicitly set the other feature is external general entities set to false. If I do this now, if I restart my server, if I do this now again, it will break with an exception and it doesn't accept my XML file again, which it should be, in my opinion, the secure default. But if you look at how to parse XML in Java, you will get probably some example like I do, and probably you don't have a clue that this can happen. So if you consume XML from a third-party source that you're not fully aware of, if you're that you're not fully control, you should be aware that you put these two in to make sure that nothing is connected that's outside of the boundary of your application. So, external entity and doc type definitions. Yep. Put this in the slides. I will share the slides afterwards. Front-end rendering. We all need to do some front-end stuff. Well, obviously, I make mistakes. I do make a lot of mistakes, but that's why I have my tooling for. Okay, it says it has a cross-site scripting issue. Well, I did in a horrible way, I did HTML creation in a Java application. You shouldn't be doing this, but I don't know. I'm a junior developer. I just copied this. And obviously, as a string parameter that comes in, without doing any form of sanitization or validation, I put it here in the output writer. You see? So this is what we call reflective cross-site scripting. If I do something like, let me actually demo this. If I go to this, and instead of the parameter here, I do something like script alert cookie. You see here? Yep. I will now get my JSession ID. And JSession ID is something you don't want to leak. And if I can do it in an alert, I can also offload this to another server. I can get your JSession ID and take that JSession ID to take over your session. And if you're admin, I'm now admin as well. Ta-da! But this is what we call reflective cross-site scripting. What I put in here is directly reflected to you. The other thing is that it says I have two cross-site scripting problems. And the second cross-site scripting problem is a little bit below, because it says writer.write string format, and then it takes the product from the database and just puts it in. This is what we call a stored cross-site scripting. Think about it. Are you the only one that owns your database and writes to your database? In many cases, it's no. because there's another tool, there's another player, there's some other machine that connects to the database and also puts data in it. The thing is, what I can do in this case, I can connect to your database, put some JavaScript in there, and because you trust your database fully, it gets out of the database into your screen and gets generated. Well, that is pretty easy if you do it like this, because this is just plain HTML. And normally you would say, like, yeah, but I'm using a framework on the front end, right? And that does sanitization and validation for me, or at least sometimes some type of sanitization. It depends. It's not by default, or sometimes it is by default, but there are just some small things that you sometimes can change to actually make sure that it's still going wrong. So if I have the product table normally here, and my product table is written with, yes, how's the framework called? Timeleaf. Normally I do a th text here, and th text is fine. Th text sanitizes the input. But the difference between, or how long do you normally take for a code review? 20 minutes, 30 minutes, or 20 seconds? The difference between th text and thu text is just one letter, but utext stands for unsanitized text. So if I do this, and let's reload my application, missing a return statement. Roll back. I've done this. It's fine. And let's go to, yep, it still works. But if I go here, and now I log out as user, log in as admin, or use the SQL injection that we just used, or that we just shown. Maybe I make melty, okay, fine, it's good, yes, no, stop bothering me. If I put something like this in, and save it, then because I did the other thing, it now starts here and it executes this, just because I put it in the database. So think about it. If, for instance, I have a SQL injection problem, and I have a cross-site scripting, I can use a SQL injection to alter some data, and I know it's getting published somewhere where that has a cross-site scripting, and I can use that to steal somebody's cookie. Normally, most of these small problems are not a single hit and not a direct hit, because you can do something else. We combine a few things and create a chain of attacks. That's why these simple things are so important for every developer to take care of. All right. Front-end rendering, blah, 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 dead. Cross-site scripting. Good. Who knows anything about hashing and encryption? All right. What is currently the best algorithm for password hashing? You scream. Exactly. First of all, we need to know what we first need to use, because they're not the same. Do I need to retrieve the original data, yes or no? Well, in passwords, we don't need to retrieve the original data. If somebody can retrieve your original password, either they store it as plain text, which is not a good thing, or they encrypt it instead of hashing it. You just need to hash it. You need to hash it again the next time you're logging in and compare the hashes. Well, nowadays, so if it's no, we need hashing. Nowadays, if you look at your system, take a look at what kind of password hashing you're using. Either you're using it yourself or you offload it. If you offload it to, I don't know, Auth0, Okta, whatever, super fine. But if you need to do it yourself, check your password algorithm, because these things change. Currently, according to a lot of white papers, including the OWASP white paper, you should use Argon2 ID, which is a nice balance between side channel and CPU attacks. But it's not just using that thing, it's also making sure that it has a nice trade-off with the amount of memory, the amount of iterations, and the amount of parallelizations you use. These are the minimums that they say. The more iterations you use, the lesser memory you can use. But the thing is, how do I update this? Well, for Spring Boot, it's not that hard, because if I go to my security configuration, you will see that I'm now using PBKDF2, and I can now use something like return the argon2 password encoder and put the right, well, I'm now using the defaults, but put the right parameters in. From this state on, I'm using the argon2 password encoder. But think about when you create this application that you also want to update this in the future. And how are you doing that? Can you deprecate somebody's password? Can you make sure that they do this again and you're actually using the newer password algorithm? Something to think about from the beginning and not like, okay, works, fine, ship it, never look at it again. Same holds for encryption. What are you currently using? Well, in this application, I'm using something outdated because if you look at it here, it says something like use of broken or risky cryptographic algorithm. I am using, as you can see here, the algorithm DES. You shouldn't be using that. That's outdated and it's not recognized by anybody anymore. Now you should be using EES, the Advanced Encryption Standard, with a secure mode. And what is a secure mode? It's either GCM or CCM. Thing is, I don't know crap about encryption. But luckily, my scanner can tell me what is outdated and what is not. And you should have these toolings on board, either in your IDE or in your pipeline to say like, hey, this is outdated. But also make sure that you can switch it. How are you thinking of that? Do you decrypt everything in a batch file and then encrypt everything again? How are you handling this? Because over time, if your application is there and you know the MVP is not the MVP, but it stays there forever, you need to take care of these things that you can actually update your encryption algorithm and do this over time multiple times. Say next month, next year, depending on the threat level, look at this again and what are the new standards? What are the current standards? Something we need to do. Consuming YAML, I'm not going into that because we don't have a lot of time anymore. So yes, fine, we can use that for unsafe releases. Sensitive data. One thing I want to show you is I'm having an API. /API/person. And what I did, I just took the entity of person and put that in a JSON output, what a lot of people do when they're prototyping. Something that you probably don't want because do you actually need the idea? Do you actually need the encrypted password here in the output? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But because it's convenient, we do a lot of this. So let's take a look at my API for a second. I have 2 more minutes. This is great. And my API controller does do anything like, hey, here, get all persons and just give it back. Well, I had this once before in an actual situation and we leaked too much information and then we had a PII data breach. The fix was quite simple. I went to the person and for instance, I don't want the ID in or I don't want the username in, doesn't matter. The only thing I had to do was add JSON ignore. And now if I restart again and do this again, the username is not showed anymore. So now you can differentiate what do you want to marshal and what you don't want to marshal. But is this a good idea? It can be, just as a username is not visible anymore, first name and last name. So you can now differentiate and make sure that some data is not available anymore. However, I think you should have a layer in between, a DTO, to make sure that for every endpoint you have a specific output created that only shows whatever you need and not deserialize the full entity. Because if you do that, you put something extra in that entity, you serialize it back into that endpoint. And because a mistake is easily made, take the effort to create DTOs like that. Okay, so you showed me all of these things. How can I get started? Well, first of all, I would say make sure that you update your dependencies. And I'm using an old school Spring Boot application, and that Spring Boot application is, I think it's using 2.6.0. Well, I scanned my dependencies, and it already says here, in your dependencies, you have a lot of issues. Some of them are Spring related. For instance, it says here, Spring Starter Web 2.60, you want to update this to 3.1.11 to get rid of all of these problems. An easy way to do this is to use the stuff that OpenRewrite is doing. Who has heard of OpenRewrite? If not, try it. Because it's quite easy to go to Open Rewrite, find a recipe for Spring 3.1, and this is just a Maven thing. And now going into my terminal and saying, okay, update it for me. So they create recipes, and that alters your POM file and your code to make sure that it's compliant with the new API standards. So if I do all of this, you will see that some things are changed. The version of my POM file will get changed. All of my Java X reference will get to Jakarta X references, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. In this way, I know that my major version of Spring takes care of a lot of vulnerabilities. And then I can go for all the dependencies to see what I can update, like the snake YAML one I didn't show you, but it's one of the problems, and then go into my code step by step by step. Well, it takes some time because the internet is not great, but please take a look at that to start from the beginning, first a major update of your framework, and then going down to your own code. Use tooling, like the tooling I'm using in my IDE or in my CLI these days, on your local machine to catch this early and often. Some of these things might sound silly and you know of them, but we are builders, not breakers. We build, hey, feature is done, ship it. We're not the only ones in the team. So keep each other accountable and lower the cognitive load that you have on your mind by using these tools as an extra to help you from the get-go. That is pretty much the time I have for today. I hope this was useful, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Cheers.